Okay, so now we've had the introduction to what just social change is, and you've listened to a couple of examples. It's now time to start to get into the material that you would actually include in your exam. So in the exam, you would be asked to explain the processes involved in social change. So you can see that up there, okay? The question would typically be worth 6 marks. They might sometimes knock it down to 4 marks, but to be totally honest, most of the questions that we've ever seen in this area are either 6 marks, just outline or explain the processes involved in social change, and that's not attached to a stimulus, or sometimes they do give you a stimulus and they expect you to be able to take details from that and incorporate that into the process. So you can see these statements here in front of you. Some of you will have been provided with them from your class teacher, and as I said before, I've not actually given them out, but you can see this is just a series of muddled statements. So what we're going to do in the next step is we're going to match these accordingly into your booklet. So if you now turn over to page 62, and what you'll see is this little diagram here, okay? So social influence processes involved in social change. Now the first thing that I just want to draw your attention to is this word here, initiation. So the word initiation, I'm sure you're already familiar with it, but initiation means to begin. So psychology dictates to us that the social change process is always initiated by some sort of minority influence. So that might be a single individual, or it might be a small group of people who perhaps have got very strong views about something in particular. So now what we've got is we've got these 6 statements that we need to match into those 3 boxes there. So all 3 of them should refer to in some way minority social influence, and they should also refer to the process of initiation. So remember, the social change hasn't occurred. This is just a minority who are trying to stick by their viewpoints initially. So if we go for this first statement at the bottom, okay, to begin with. So if we just have a quick look at this statement, it says the minority, so remember we're focusing in on a small group of people to begin with. The minority are drawing attention to a particular issue in society, and what they're attempting to do, okay, through their minority viewpoints, is they're trying to raise awareness. Now typically with a minority influence, that awareness usually comes through some sort of protesting. So you can see here that the minority initially raises awareness through protests. So you'll have probably seen rallies, perhaps in London, perhaps in Leeds city centre. Protests are obviously there to make a bit of noise and to get people to sit up and take notice. So all that action is doing at that initial point is that the minority is drawing attention to the fact that they are concerned about that particular issue. So we've got raising awareness through protesting, and we've sometimes got campaigns. Now, what happens at that stage is that message is presented in a very, very consistent fashion. Now, you should already know what the word consistent means, but it means to never change. So they hold those opinions and they're not going to falter from them. So they consistently protest, they consistently engage in the campaigning, and they won't change from those minority viewpoints. And that will all draw attention to the fact that the issue needs some sort of change. What they will be doing through those protests is that they will be trying to challenge the majority views, so already getting people to take notice. So what you need to do for me at this stage, if you haven't already figured it out, is you need to put this bottom statement into that top box there. Okay, so if you can all just do that for me now, and possibly highlight the keywords that I've drawn attention to, or maybe add on extra little bits of detail. Okay, so now that we've eliminated that statement there, okay, so now that we've got rid of that bottom one, we need to have a look at what happens next. So the minority have drawn attention to the particular issue. What they will then seem to be doing is they will seem to be making sacrifices for their cause. Now, the sacrifices are often an absolutely crucial part of the social change process. This just shows how committed they are to their new belief system and to their opinions surrounding that matter. They will take very, very big risks, often for their lives. We've got some examples of people who have been engaged in very violent conduct, and for some people that's resulted in a loss of life just for the cause of social change. Other examples that we've got here for sacrifices are imprisonment. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Nelson Mandela, but that man went to prison for years and years for his cause. Eventually he was released and he became the leader of South Africa, but for a very long period of time, because of his views and because he wanted whites and blacks to be equal in South Africa, he was imprisoned. So we have got lots of sacrifices. So often violent methods result in them having to sacrifice themselves, imprisonment, a loss of income, or often it can just be willing to be prejudiced against, so willing to be treated differently in some way, but they're standing up for the rights at that stage. So that statement there then, that one obviously needs to be placed in to this box here, so you need to pop that one into the second box down. And then all we need to do is, still looking at the minority influence, we need to just have a think about what that final step in the process would be. Now, the process of paying attention to these new minority views, it does not happen very, very quickly. So what we see at this point in time is a little what we call, or what we refer to as, a snowball effect. So the minorities group's message starts to spread very, very slowly, and so some parts of the majority at that point in time start to pay attention to how this minority is acting, and that can lead to other people being affected by this minority influence at that point. You can see this is what you have got there in the section relating to minority influence. Okay, so remember, just to reiterate, we're focusing on the initiation process. How does social change begin? It always begins with a minority who draw attention to their particular issue and their qualms. They protest, they do campaigns to draw attention to that issue. They're seen to be making sacrifices. They make commitment to that cause. They consistently present their views until eventually, this could be after years and years, we end up with a small snowball effect where people start to listen to those alternative viewpoints. Now, if we move out of the process, you can see that the shift changes. So this time, we're concerned with how the social change is maintained. So remember, snowball effect has occurred by this point, and some people in the majority have already changed their views. But what we want to happen at this point is we want the majority, to fully accept those views, and we want them really to internalise it. So you all know what the word internalise means. We want that majority to accept that view both publicly, privately and permanently. So if we look at the statements that we've already eliminated here, so we're not using this one anymore because we've already got that. We don't want the snowball effect and we don't want the paying attention to it. So we're left then with two statements really that fit into this particular section of the booklet. So information is being spread so that individuals are aware of how other people are now behaving. So we've had the minority to begin with. Now a small proportion of the majority of society are changing their behaviour. That then starts to sweep through society. So people now become very aware of the fact that there is this kind of like majority influence occurring. So if we want to just place that top statement there underneath this box here, all right, so into that box, and this is again referring to how the social change is being maintained. And then the final statement that we need in this box here, if I just bring up the statements again, what we see is that at that point, once people begin to become aware that there is an alternative view, and people start to change the way that they behave, we get to a point where that becomes the new social norm. So for example, and I can speak for this myself, when the smoking campaign originally started, at that point in time, you must remember, some of you won't be able to remember this far back, but smoking at that point was very, very popular. So when the smoking ban was put in place initially, it wasn't rolled out across the country. It was only a handful of places who were banning you from smoking in public. However, because people's views and opinions towards smoking had begun to change, it quite rapidly, I'd say with over the space of about 18 months, it did become the social norm. So even if you were in a place that didn't impose those rules and regulations, for example, I remember going on holiday to, I think it was to Italy at that point in time, where there was no smoking laws enforced, but I had internalised a new social norm. So even though I was quite within my legal rights in that restaurant that I was in Italy to sit there and have a cigarette, the social norm to me, the typical behaviour to me, was that I was going to go outside and have my cigarette outside because I didn't want to offend the people sat around me. So at this stage where we've got the majority now accepting that minority view, the behaviour does become perceived as typical. Lots of the time it's through advertising campaigns. So if you think back to the smoking effort to try and calm smoking down, make less people engage in that behaviour, there has been heavy advertising campaigns. Obviously it's all over the smoking packets, it's on billboards, it's everywhere you go in the hospital. So that, with all examples of social change really, once they get to this stage and they can see that the majority is starting to accept that new minority viewpoint, the advertising is often stepped up a notch, and then at that point that will persuade the few people who are remaining, and perhaps if we want to refer to smokers as the example there, the few people who still believe that smoking is fine and that they should be allowed to smoke in public places, that use of advertising campaigns will persuade those final few people to change their behaviour. Now, if we just think at this stage that we've had the initiation of the minority influence, we've had the maintenance through majority influence and changing people's social norms of any, is this phase here, the obedience phase. So once the majority have been persuaded and this new way of thinking has been accepted, it often then falls to the government to try and impose some laws, okay? So new rules and new laws are imposed on society, and that will attempt to force the social change upon everybody else. So for example, the smoking ban. You are no longer in this country allowed to smoke in a public place. Very, very recently, you're no longer allowed to smoke whilst you've got a child in the car. So the government have taken it upon themselves now that enough people accept that behaviour as typical, so we do not like smoking anymore in our society, then they need to impose rules to ensure that everybody sticks to that. So what you should have filled in on page 62 of your booklet is the entire social change process. Remember, there are a lot of key terms built in within that process. It's your job really for the exam to be able to use as many of those bits of psychology terminology to ensure that you get good marks. At this stage, you might just want to read back over that social change process, and then in the next video, we're going to look at some examples and how we go about applying that to a stimulus.